So, Ireland at the Turn of the Century by Ryan Curtin. So, the Great Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, was a period of Irish history that lasted from 1845 to 1849. It caused mass starvation, mass exodus, and the death of millions of Irish people. So, a little bit of the backstory before the famine. For a long time, Irish papists, who were Irish Catholics, who held the majority of Ireland, were not allowed to own land. Because of the English penal laws of 1695, they forbid Irish papists from owning land. This didn't change until the early 19th century, and while they were technically allowed to own land, most of the land was still owned by English landlords or absentee landlords. They allowed farmer tenants to own small portions of land, which even in years of good crops, these small portions of land were still not really enough to feed the Irish. The majority of them lived in poverty and depended on what they called America's great gift to the Irish, the potato. The calorie-dense starch was a good source of food and it was very cheap. And by 1840, more than half the population of Ireland who were in poverty relied on the potato. So it wasn't good when the famine struck and basically took away their one good source of food. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, but this water mold fungus caused the potato disease called late blight or potato blight. It also causes a similar effect on tomatoes, but for the potato, it basically destroys the tubers of the potato, which caused the crop failures for several years in a row. You can see the rotting on the inside. I would not want to eat that even if I was starving. So the English involvement in the famine caused many historians to consider this a genocide on the Irish people, or as you can see right here, Ireland's Holocaust. So their involvement in it, so the English landlords of Ireland still exported the Irish grains from Ireland to England. They kept the price of food extremely high, artificially high, and these landlords were protected under English law. So if you were a poor farmer tenant in Ireland, the price of food was basically too high for you to afford, and your only source of good food being the potato was currently not a factor at this point during these years of potato blight. So this caused the death of over 1 million Irish people throughout the island, which at this point was 1/8 the entire nation's population. This caused a mass exodus of Ireland as many people tried to flee the famine and the English rule, and caused a great rise in Irish nationalism across the island. So immigration, which is known as the leaving of one's own country to permanently settle in another, was an effect by the famine. Many people tried to escape the famine and the political turmoil. So immigration was, while Ireland was at this point already Christianized for several centuries, they still held on to their old Celtic/Norse traditions of extended families or clans. You know, they held the idea that a family should be all under one roof, and they took great pride in their land and where they come from. So to leave went against their old traditions and their sense of honor. So after Oliver Cromwell's crimes against Ireland and the mass death he caused, many Irish were forced to leave in the 1600s. And reportedly, many of them were actually forced to go to the West Indies as slaves. So emigration is not something that was new to the Irish people, unfortunately. The famine, though, in the in the 19th century, Ireland saw more people leave than ever before in its history. From 1815 to 1845, 1 million people left Ireland. During the years of the famine, 2.5 million people left. And for the rest of the century, about 4 million people left. So throughout those 100 years, around 8 million people left Ireland, which was actually the same number as its total peak population before the famine, which was also 8 million. And 80% of people who left were between the ages of 18 and 30. This was because most people during this time in Ireland were very, very poor, and leaving wasn't free. So a lot of times they could only afford to have their youngest leave in hopes that they would find a better life. This is what the origins of the famous song "Danny Boy" is from. The story of a father having to leave his son, send his son away to America to try to find a better life away from the famine and away from the English crown. So the steamboat also assisted the Irish during this time. The first steamboat to cross the Atlantic happened in 1833. It only took 3 weeks to go from Canada to England. So during this time, more than half of Irish immigrants traveled to North America via the steamboat. And those who left Ireland during the famine mostly went to America, Canada, England, and Australia. And the effects today, more than 80 million people around the world claim to be of Irish descent. And you compare that to the modern day population of Ireland, which is only 4 million. That's absolutely crazy. So before the famine, Ireland had a peak population of over 8 million. And today, Ireland's population has still not recovered from this, as it sits at only 4 million. As President John F. Kennedy once famously said during a trip to Ireland, most countries send out oil or iron, steel or gold or some other crop, but Ireland only has one export, and that's its people. So Home Rule was an Irish movement that was made popular in the late 19th century to the early 20th century. This was an effect from the famine and the resentment of the English involvement during this time. The people who supported this movement wanted to establish an Irish parliament independent from the English one in Westminster. So in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, known as Ulster, there was a predominant Protestant population that wanted to remain part of England. So this caused a bit of division between the north and the rest of Ireland that wanted to be independent. So during the English general election of 1910, the Liberal Party lost the majority to the Conservative Party, and their leader, Herbert Asquith, promised the Irish Home Rule so long as they would help the Liberal Party gain the majority during the next election. So this caused a great deal of controversy in Ireland. In 1912, the Home Rule Bill was brought before the English Parliament, and it was passed by the House of Commons, but it was rejected by the House of Lords. So it was decided that they would wait 2 years, and then it would officially become law in 1914. So this was seen as a victory for the nationalists, who were led by the famous John Redmond, but to the Northerners, this was not a victory. And Edward Carson of the North formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, whose goal was to oppose the Home Rule Bill by any means necessary, even if they had to resort to violence. As a response to this, the Nationalists formed the Irish Volunteers, and James Larkin, who was a great man of labor in Ireland, who also wrote the folk song The Rising of the Moon, he formed the Irish Citizens Army. So in 1914, the Great War, World War I, broke out, and the English basically decided that they couldn't deal with Ireland with more pressing matters going on right now, so they decided that Home Rule would not be brought before Parliament and not be made into law. So the nationalists were obviously upset by this, and they saw World War I as a great opportunity to rebel against the English. They planned the Easter Rebellion, known as the Easter Rising, and in 1916, over 1,200 Irish men and women worked to capture the capital of Dublin. They were led by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Irish Citizens Army, and the feminist organization, of which I'm also not trying to pronounce right now. Some of the rebel leaders being Thomas Clark, Patrick Pearse, James Larkin, and James Connolly. They took the capital of Dublin and read aloud basically their Declaration of Independence. Although it didn't last long, the English retook the city. They arrested over 3,000 Irish people and they executed the leaders. There was no trial, no jury. They just took the rebel leaders and basically shot them with machine guns. So while the rebellion was a failure, this sparked out widespread rebellion throughout the entire island. The Irish people were no longer interested in John Redmond's ideal of home rule, and instead they would embrace Sinn Féin's philosophy that Ireland must be freed at any cost. Sinn Féin would eventually become the political wing of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So this led to all-out war with the English, the establishment of the Republic of Ireland that was independent, and Northern Ireland, which would remain part of England. The treaty that caused this also sparked the Irish Civil War over those who accepted the treaty and those who thought that they shouldn't accept the treaty. The creation of the IRA, being the Irish Republican Army, and the following decades of guerrilla warfare against the English to free the North, known as the Troubles. So, yeah, the rest of the 1900s was not good in terms of political turmoil. And as any Irish person will say, I'm leaving a lot out right now. So, but that was basically the history of Ireland from the 1850s to the 1900s.